the manner in which he humiliates the president of France constantly. He talks about Macron publicly as if he was a flunky. I don't think Europe today sees United States as a reliable partner. In this context, India becomes attractive. Now, Europe has to look for alternative markets. Now we're going to chair the BRICS summit this year. And all the players, Russia will be there, Xi Jinping will be there.
Welcome to FO Live. My name is Rovira. I'm a student of European Politics at Columbia University and an intern at Fair Observer. With me today is Peter Isackson. We all know him. He is Chief Strategy Officer at Fair Observer. And today, once again, we have the great pleasure of welcoming Kanwal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary of India, but also former ambassador to Russia, France, Egypt, and Turkey, and a key voice in India's strategic thinking for over 4 decades. Mr. Sibal, welcome.
Thank you.
So today we'll be discussing the landmark trade deal between India and the European Union concluded last Tuesday, 27th of January. So, to my first question, Mr. Sibal, after nearly 2 decades of negotiations, India and the EU have finally signed a comprehensive trade agreement that both sides are calling the mother of all deals. So, this pact brings together India's 1.4 billion strong market and the EU's economic bloc of 27 nations. Could you please walk us through what makes this agreement so significant? What are the key elements that finally brought these two major economies to the table after years of stalled negotiations?
Well, it is, in fact, in terms of size, a mother of all deals because it brings together Europe and India. And given the size of India's demography and the market, we are now the 4th largest economy. In a couple of years, we'll become the 3rd largest. And Europe is as big an economy, as big a market as the United States of America. So if Europe and India have struck a trade deal, it opens up enormous possibilities of increased trade, investment, technology transfers, and other forms of cooperation between India and Europe. Because once you have this kind of a deal, then the possibilities of cooperating more at the international level on many international and regional issues becomes easier because the linkages become stronger. Now, as it happens, Europe is a high consumption economy, a very rich continent. It has a lot of advanced technology in various domains in which India is interested, but it has problems. And some of the problems are very low growth rates. Also, the demography is such that while it's a high consumption market, it cannot sustain the economies that they have today without being able to export. And Europe is a highly developed export entity, and it will always look at markets outside. Now, China obviously has been a major partner of the European Union, especially Germany. In fact, the Germany's largest external partner was not within the EU, it was China. Now, there are problems between Europe and China, not strictly limited to the problems that China creates for Europe, but these are problems that they create for everyone with their very excessive manufacturing capacities. They have to offload their goods in the international market because they are not developing a highly consumption-oriented economy internally. And therefore, they have become the largest trading partner of all countries. And there's very little that other countries can do with regard to constraining and restricting this because China has not developed capacities in so many areas, in critical technology, in rare earths, in the solar panels, in the renewables and everything else, they have captured not only the production but also the processes, and they have started using that now as a leverage against other countries. Europe has been complaining that while they have huge trade with China, China has not opened up its market sufficiently to Europe. They want to have more balanced trade, quite apart from other issues regarding seeing China as a systematic challenge to Europe, a lack of shared values and lack of democracy and all those things. Now, I've explained all this because in this context, India becomes attractive. Now, Europe has to look for alternative markets, and since they want to, and this is true of everybody, resilient and trustworthy supply chains and not be subject to these kind of pressures from China, they're looking at other partners, and India is an attractive partner, a very attractive partner, because one can always talk about shared values and that we are a democratic country, we are an open society. Uh, Therefore, the unpredictability of dealing with India and getting trapped into something is far, far less than in the case of China. Now, added to all this, and that is why the deal was accelerated and we were able to reach a conclusion within 2 years of intensive negotiations or something like that, is because of Mr. Trump and United States of America. Uh, because the United States has humiliated Europe. The trade deal that was struck with Europe was very one-sided, where they imposed 15% tariffs on Europe and no tariffs on the United States of America. Plus, Europe committed itself to buying $750 billion of LNG during the next 3 years while Trump is in power, plus $500 billion of investment commitments. And now, of course, it's run into difficulty because the European Parliament has stalled the deal because of Greenland and other things. But other than this, uh, I don't think Europe today sees United States as a reliable partner, and they see problems down the road with Trump's highly mercurial and unpredictable and egocentric policies. Look at since we are talking about Europe. Look at the manner in which, and since I was ambassador to France, I'm a little more sensitive to this. The manner in which he humiliates the president of France constantly. He talks about Macron publicly as if he was a flunky. He's been threatening Macron that you have to double your pharmaceutical prices, and if you don't, I'll impose 100% tariffs on your wines and champagne and everything else. And Macron balks at this, saying, "I can't do it." He said, "No, no, you're going to do it. You're going to do it," and etc. etc. So this is quite apart from the security aspect and everything else. So Europe, therefore, has and India too, because we are also under pressure from the United States. We are the most tariffed country along with Brazil. Actually, he has given some exemptions to Brazil, which he has not given us. So in effect, we are the most tariffed country, and we don't know what is going to be the play ahead. And therefore, both from the Indian side and the European side, there has been a desire to expand our options, to get out of the clutch of the unpredictability the United States has brought into the international trading system, and that accounts for the fact that we've been able to reach this deal, which has on the details of it we can discuss later. But I personally think it's a very good thing.
Yeah. If I can just step in there and ask you a question, Kanwal. Um, you draw a lot of attention to Trump as really the trigger for this whole event, which is a monumental event, and the Europeans are stuck of it today. We didn't know about it until like 2 days ago in Europe, which is surprising because there was been a long discussion about Mercosur, which was approved just weeks ago with Latin America, and that's caused a lot of grief, especially here in France, because of the threat they see to the agricultural sector. But Trump is causing serious reactions in a lot of places in the world, in Europe and in the global South. But Trump isn't new. I mean, we had 4 years of it. The world had 4 years of him between 2017 and 2021. And he was, I think, the situation here in Europe is that people were saying when Biden came in, everything's going to come back to normal. We're going to understand the relationship we had with the US before, really pretty much as a vassal, which is what Bart de Wever said at Davos last week. He said, we used to be a happy vassal, and now are we becoming a miserable slave? So in Europe, the situation has changed because they felt that this was an aberration. And my question to you, Kanwal, is in the global south and even in Europe, have people changed their take on what Trump is and what he represents in terms of the image of the US, or the idea that people have in terms of countries, what they have in relation to being subordinate to the US?
Well, the thing is that Trump has challenged the structures of the transatlantic relationship in a way that has not been done since the Second World War. He has, in his first term, he questioned the utility of NATO, yes, of course. But now he has gone much further because on an issue of security, when there is a war going on in Ukraine, what has he done? He has eliminated NATO from these discussions. He eliminated Europe from these discussions with Russia and with Putin. He's gone over the head and talking and directly to Putin. That may be, in some ways, a good thing, that one can debate that. But the point is, for Europe, a conflict on the European continent, which would affect, in their view, their own security going ahead if Russia comes out on top, they are not being allowed full participation in the discussions that will lead to a potential resolution of the conflict. This is utter humiliation, which means that when it comes to fundamental issues of European security, the United States is not giving adequate attention and weight to Europe for whatever reason.
But isn't there a good reason for that? Because it was Biden's initiative to go to war with, to get involved in the war with between Russia and Ukraine. At the time, Macron, we remember, was trying to engage in some kind of backdoor negotiations with Putin to try and ameliorate the situation. And historically, in the last 15 years, 20 years, I remember Sarkozy and Merkel were opposed to the idea of expanding NATO into Ukraine. So the European position wasn't aligned initially with the US. And it was Biden who said, let's go. This is where even Obama was hesitant. He had said at one point that this is a local problem, it's not a US problem. But as soon as Biden launched the war, the Europeans had the choice of resisting, defining their position of autonomy, or going along with Biden. And they went along. And then they were left behind by Trump, who said, we don't need you. And in a certain sense, isn't Trump right to say someone who's just following someone else has no constructive role to play?
Well, a couple of things. One is that Russia too thinks somewhat similarly to what Trump thinks about Europe's role in all this, because their view is that the real interlocutor to finding a solution to the Ukraine conflict is the United States of America, because the Ukraine conflict is actually a symptom of US military domination, security domination of Europe. After all, it is U.S. missiles and U.S. forces, which are they're in the frontline states. After all, they have put advanced missiles in Poland and in Romania. They have huge military bases in Europe itself. And then Russia actually, two reasons, sees United States, relations with United States in the security domain as part of a larger balance of relationship between United States and Russia. That is not only limited to what's happening in Europe, but the larger disarmament, nuclear disarmament negotiations and the agreements that were reached. In other words, strategic stability. For Russia, strategic stability is extremely important. And in this context, Europe is not a player. The strategic stability has to be established between United States and Russia. And for Russia, it is important also for a different reason. Because economically and other matters, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, well, the Soviet Union economically was not a great power in any case, but their position internationally has greatly diminished. But when it comes to strategic stability, where you have a balance of nuclear weapons and everything else, gives Russia a sort of a position that they enjoyed during the Cold War as the principal security interlocutor of Russia, and that together they have to manage strategic balance globally. Therefore, they are interested, for this reason also, to treat the United States as their principal partner. They don't care about Europe as a threat or as part of a strategic stability. After all, if the INF agreement was reached and it has been debunked, what was the INF agreement? That don't place these intermediate missiles in Europe. And whose missiles were they? They were US missiles, not the European missiles. Anyway, so that is the reason why, some of the reasons why Europe has been excluded, both by Trump and by Putin, from any serious negotiation to find a solution to the Ukraine conflict. In addition to that, you are right, when it came to the Georgian conflict, Sarkozy was active, and he prides himself even now, and he says it publicly, how he engaged Putin and managed to find some kind of a, some kind of a stability there. Now, I think what has happened is a few things. First of all, France has steadily lost credibility with the Kremlin, with Putin and with Russia. And part of the reason why this has happened is the confessions of Hollande and Merkel that actually, they saw Minsk as some kind of a, stopgap arrangement which will give chance to Ukraine to build itself militarily, etc., etc. In other words, although they were the guarantees of the Minsk II agreement, but they couldn't hold their part of the bargain. That is an additional reason why Putin and others say that, look, we gave you a role. In the Minsk agreement, it was France and Germany and Russia and Ukraine that were involved. We gave you an opportunity, but you wasted that opportunity completely, and then you made confessions later on that actually it was all an interim thing and their heart was not in it, etc., etc. So that has also worked against them in terms of playing a role. Now I find, frankly, France is a bit disappointed. It's become very aggressive, very cantankerous towards Russia. The latest thing what they've done is to board one of their ships and so-called shadow fleet and this and that, contrary to international law. Whatever the French government may say about the legality of this, it is not a legal operation under international law. And which are the two countries which are most active in insisting that they will want to position their troops on Ukrainian soil after a peace agreement when Putin has repeatedly said that they are not going to accept this. But yet the discourse is this. And then, you know, unfortunately, Macron is also on record. Maybe this is rhetoric, but he's also on record to say that if Russia wins in Ukraine, then Europe itself will be threatened, and we have to protect our future generations from the Russian threat. Now I mean, as an outsider, as somebody from the global south, I can't understand why they are saying that Russia is going to invade a NATO country or invade France or invade Germany. It doesn't make sense at all. So, and Macron, and I'll end there, and Macron has been revealing conversations, private conversations with Putin, with having journalists in the room and then relaying them publicly, and you can hear what is happening, etc., etc. So that kind of playing to the gallery and showmanship doesn't create trust in terms of confidence building between the Kremlin and the Elysee. So Merz has been very aggressive. Now he's toned down. Lately, he has toned down because he's become very weak politically inside Germany, and he's feeling politically insecure. So there's a change in tone. But you look at what he was saying just a few weeks earlier. Very aggressive statements against Russia. Now, I'll end with this, on this, that unfortunately, as I see from the outside, the driving force, there are two things. The driving force in this anti-Russian demonization are the Baltic states and Poland. And the United States, of course, is fully behind Poland. So now in this 27-member European Union, you have to have agreements on the basis of consensus. And these small states, which in themselves count for nothing, and they have no geopolitical experience worth the name internationally, but within Europe, they are exerting a lot of weight because the moral question, the value question, and all this narrative about poor Ukraine, which is a European country, which is a democracy, is being pulverized by this authoritarian, heartless state of Russia and things like that. Now the European narrative is now accepted, it seems to be accepted by the public in general. So I think that it's a mixture of many things which accounts for the fact that Europe is not a player when it comes to finding a solution to the Ukraine problem. And I had one last thing. After all, when negotiations were taking place in Istanbul, and a kind of a preliminary agreement has been reached between Ukraine and Russia, who sabotaged it? It is Mr. Boris Johnson of the
That's
EU.
right.
And UK is actually, if you don't mind my saying so, it's a strong word. It is a malevolent force when it comes to Europe's relations with Russia. There is some imperial hang that Britain still suffers from when it comes to dealing with Russia.
Yes, if I can say something about Europe, because when you talk about Europe, it's really difficult to know what you're talking about. Are you talking about the governments of the nations of Europe? You mentioned the Baltic states playing an outsized role, but whichever govern, and perhaps the reason they're more important, or they're playing a more important role than they deserve, is because there is some kind of basic political unity or trust inside those countries. Whereas in France, in Germany, and I think in the UK, it's clear that that kind of confidence in one's own government, of the people in their government, is simply not there. And we're seeing that the AfD is now, in Germany, is I think they're up to about 40% in the polls, which is why Merz is panicking a bit and changing his tone. But what the AfD, and they've just released this week, they've released their program, their platform, and it's very pro-Russian. So you can see that when you're talking about Europe, the European people, which are people from a lot of different countries, are wondering who they are in terms of the nations they belong to. And they've never quite understood what they were meant to be as Europeans, part of the Union, which is why the turnout for European parliamentary elections is low. But it's also low because the parliament has no power. It makes no decisions. It has no direct influence, impact on policies. So Europe is a very confused place today, which is why I come back to what I said earlier, and that there's good reason for Europe not to be involved in any kind of serious discussions on any issue, on any geopolitical issue, because there is no way of defining a coherent position that represents Europe and Europe's interests.
You're right there. A couple of things. One, looking from the outside, Brussels now has eroded a great deal the sovereign powers of individual member states. It's become very powerful. Its bureaucracy has become very powerful. And they're taking decisions as seen from the outside, even in domains where they really don't have the authority. On the defense issues, for example. Now, we've signed a defense and security and defense agreement between Europe and India as part of the latest FTA developments. Around that, we've signed that also, which, having dealt with Europe for a long time, surprises me a little bit. But when it comes to real defense cooperation agreement with regard to big projects and transfer of technology and work shares and stuff like that, all the sensitive issues and the choices to be made, it is the sovereign governments that you deal with. You don't go to Brussels and say that I'm going to buy 114 Rafales. You go to France, you negotiate in France. You go to Germany to say that we've now the 8 submarine that we want you to build with an air independent propulsion system. You don't go to Brussels to negotiate that. But Brussels now they have a person who is in charge of defense policy, which is apparently not in the charter, but they have.
No, it can't be in the charter because there's no way of consolidating all the defense positions of each of the countries.
And the second thing I'd like to say in this is just a nuance to what you said. I entirely agree that Europe currently is not playing a positive role in terms of finding a solution, and hence the Americans are excluding it from negotiations, and so are the Russians. However, I think Europe is not a negligible entity. It's not a negligible entity, and therefore, if somehow there could be a better understanding between United States and Europe to find a way out of what's happening in Ukraine. In other words, actually what I've been saying, I've said a couple of times, is that Europe had actually created an impasse for themselves by outing themselves from the negotiations and finding it extremely difficult to walk back, because then the public would ask them, why have you done all that, what you've done? Transferred billions of euros and arms and everything else, when your own societies are suffering from deprivations and there's a social conflicts that are emerging and this and that, then why didn't you look for peace earlier? So they can't walk back. They walked into an impasse. But I thought that since Trump took the decision to reach out to Russia and see if a solution could be found, they could actually have used this as an off-ramp. And under cover of that, they could have started changing their position gradually. And then actually saying that, well, we are supporting America's efforts and this and that. That would have been a sane, rational way out of the situation, but they have dug themselves in further by throwing as many spanners in the works as they can with regard to what Trump is doing. And it's essentially because Trump is a very irrational entity. So I suppose there's a problem there too.
Yeah.
Right. Just to shift away a little bit from Europe and more towards India. Do you think with this trade deal, India will be opening its markets and key sectors to Europeans? Do you think, based on your experience navigating India's bureaucracy, that your regulatory ecosystem actually is ready to absorb the scale of integration that this deal demands? Or do you think the country might be setting itself up for friction down the road?
I think it's the opposite. Actually, Europe is highly regulated. And the concern here is by those who are not over enthusiastic about the deal, as generally people in India are. They are pointing out to this that Europe has such their standards, the regulatory processes are such that even if theoretically there are openings which is based on tariffs, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get access to the European market because of these. Now, the CBAM, for example, is a huge issue, and we have ceded ground on that. What we have said is that whatever the flexibilities that you are giving to the United States of America with regard to the CBAM, you will give to India too. And then we try to sort of give it a positive slant, saying that look, this will induce us to go in for more climate friendly technologies in the production of steel and uranium and aluminium and everything else. But the phytosanitary and other regulations of Europe are very strict. The health standards are very strict. So we'll have to upgrade a lot of things on our side to meet the regulatory standards of Europe. America has a problem with the regulatory standards of Europe. And then there are the digital issues and everything else, which are minefields because we have our own ambitions with regard to developing an autonomous capability with regard to artificial intelligence and digital sovereignty and stuff like that. And Europe has views of its own to see if these issues can be navigated to mutual advantage will be a challenge. But having said that, the base for increased cooperation has been created. And fortunately, apart from some of the issues I've mentioned, which will be problematic and will have to be addressed, there is complementarity between the Indian economy and the European economy. I mean, when it comes to the issues, highly employment intensive parts of our economy, whether it is textile or leather or pharmaceutical, not pharmaceutical so much, but gems and jewelry and this and that. We have about $35 billion of trade in this with the European Union. Now, if the duties to this, once it is ratified, drops to zero, then certainly these sectors, which have been hit by the American tariffs very severely, will find an outlet in Europe. And when it comes to industrial products and this and that, Europe can provide us those. And so we are not competing in those areas with Europe. Now, when it comes to automobiles and wines and this and that, we have agreed to certain tariff reductions, gradually tapering off tariff reductions. The duties on cars will come down from 110% or whatever it is to 40%, and on wines and spirit to progressively to much lower figures than the whatever the figure is now, 100 and whatever percent. And these were issues which were very dear to the heart of the Europeans, and we have agreed to that. Look, in India, they have now made a conscious decision because we've entered into FTAs, Australia and UAE, we're negotiating with Canada, that we are now willing to be less protectionist. There is now clear understanding that protectionist levels of the Indian economy have to be reduced. And the FTA with the UK and now with the EU reflect that. And this is part of reform of the Indian economy and making us much more involved in the global supply chains, upgrading our own performance in these sectors of interest to us. Uh, so uh, I think the regulation and bureaucracy on our side is not a problem of the kind that that exists in Europe, because the Europeans themselves, after all, what are the Americans saying about Europe? And people within Europe, I read commentaries that you've lost innovation, you've lost this, you lost that, because you regulate so much. You know, you don't let people do what they want, so, and that you're being left behind. This is a critique that the Europeans themselves are making about the system that they have developed, which is governed by the bureaucracy in Brussels, which are very fond of producing huge documents with a lot of articles and sub-articles, which govern everything. In Europe.
Yeah, Europe is going through a lot of changes and a lot of asking itself a lot of questions. And this is happening in each nation. It's happening on the continent in general. But I think I don't know if here in France, people have had time yet to react to the significance of the deal with India. But I think it will have a big impact because it represents a different way of thinking about the relationship with the rest of the world. Europe has become very isolated. The sense of who we are as Europeans has created a lot of confusion. And this direct link to the global south and on a major scale and in conditions that are seen as being very equitable, I think can have a major impact. But it'll take time to understand how that's going to play out and what that impact will be.
Couple of comments. One is that unlike in the case of Mercosur, which has become very contentious because of agriculture, agriculture is out of the India-EU FTA, which means that in terms of a negative public reaction, we will not see the same kind of resistance in Europe. With regard to immigration issues, basically, we've also agreed on a mobility agreement, but mobility is not immigration. One should not create this confusion. Mobility simply means that our professional workers would have easier entry in terms of doing their job in Europe for Indian companies, or if the European companies want skilled workers, then they can bring them in. So there is that aspect, which I don't think will create the same kind of problem as immigration, which is largely not only illegal, but they are a burden on the European societies in terms of welfare, schemes that these people, and then of course the cultural problems and everything else. I won't go into that. So that issue is, so agriculture is out. There is no threat of immigration of the kind that worries some European countries, European societies. So therefore, we have been insulated from these potential negative reactions from the Europeans. So I think the outlook is positive. Now, a couple of things have not yet been done. One is that there was, when we talked about an FTA, there was to be a separate investment agreement and a separate agreement on geographical indicators. Mm-hmm. Those two are still pending and they'll be worked out. But the bigger part of having a FTA, that has been done, and I think the FTA itself will create a better incentive to reach a mutually acceptable investment agreement also.
Right. You mentioned negative perceptions in Europe. What about the fact that India still buys significant oil from Moscow. And as we all know, discounted Russian crude has been crucial for India's energy security. Are European nations really all okay with this, or is it something that could potentially resurface later on?
Well, a
If
couple
I
of
could just say one thing about that, I think it's more a US problem than a European one, because the US policy has insisted on, and especially Trump, on putting tariffs on anyone who buys oil from Russia, and that was the heated discussion that took place ever since the beginning of the Russian invasion. The Europeans, in their role of vassals, went along with that, and they've passed a number of their own sanctions. But I don't think it has the same psychological impact for Europeans as it does for Americans.
a few comments on this. One is that when Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa and Kaya Kallas came here for the FTA, both Ursula von der Leyen and Kaya Kallas even more, they did speak about India's relations with Russia and we buying oil from Russia, and made no bones of the fact that this was an issue on which the two sides did not agree, and that Europe will continue to talk to us about this. Europe has also sanctioned a few Indian companies for violating European sanctions in dealing with Russia, which is a pity because this is going down the wrong road in terms of application of sanctions on India on account of that. But we have made our position very, very clear. Our foreign minister has been pretty vocal about it while visiting European countries, and he's visited all of them, including the Baltic states and Poland, and he attended the Munich Security Conference, and he had some hard truths to convey to the Europeans. A couple of years ago, he told them that what we buy from Russia in the whole year, you buy from Russia in one day when it comes to oil and gas. So therefore, you have to be a little more reflective of your own relations with Russia. Even today, Europe buys oil and gas from Russia. Of course, their argument is we are decreasing our supplies, and in 2027 we will stop buying all oil from all gas from Russia, and we've reduced the oil purchases drastically, etc. But that's neither here nor there. After the war has gone on for 4 years, and for 4 years, Europe has been buying enormous quantities of oil and gas, and therefore fueling Putin's war machine, the kind of charge that is made against us. Number two, what we have said, and we reiterate it all the time, is that we did not violate any law. On the contrary, we bought discounted Russian oil. In the sense, the discounted price was fixed by whom? By United States. And all our purchases were at the discounted price because our companies did not want to fall afoul of US sanctions, because these have repercussions on other areas of our economy in terms of access to the US financial markets and everything else. And our banks will not give loans to companies who want to buy Russian oil, because they will then come under the purview of OFAC in the United States. So we've been very clear on the ground that we've not violated any so-called sanctions, which in any case we consider illegal because they have no sanction of the United Nations. Nevertheless, we abided by them. Now what has happened is that after this 50% jet tariffs imposed by the United States, which include 25% penalty tariffs on us buying Russian oil, our offtake of Russian oil has drastically reduced. Our two biggest private companies that were buying Russian oil are no longer buying oil. The Ambani Group, Reliance, has already announced publicly that they are not buying any more Russian oil. And the Public sector companies, mind you, all Russian companies have not been sanctioned. Only the big ones have been. So the unsanctioned Russian companies can still uh, make oil available in the international market on the spot market, and therefore our companies, public sector companies, if the price is attractive, will buy that oil, but it will be in much reduced quantities uh, as before. Now, what Trump and the United States are accusing Europe of is duplicity and hypocrisy, because they are saying that India bought discounted Russian oil, refined it in India, and Europeans bought the refined products of India from India in a very big way, which were actually a product in part of Russian oil, and therefore you are hypocrites, because you have indirectly you are still buying Russian origin energy. So that kind of an argument is going on between Europe and United States. And finally, you may have seen what dissent the Treasury Secretary has said. They're very unhappy that India and Europe have signed this FTA, because what dissent has said is, which is ridiculous, that while uh, we were, batting for the people of Ukraine by imposing tariffs on India for buying Russian oil, the Europeans, you were happy to buy uh, Russian oil through India, and were ignoring the plight of the Ukrainian people. This is he has said that officially. So, so it's this. Now, finally, I would say this. At the moment, U.S. is negotiating with Russia. Let's see what happens. They're going to have renewed talks on February 1 again in Abu Dhabi between the two sides, with the Americans present. If things move forward and there is some light at the end of the tunnel, then I think the pressures on India will get diluted. If, however, things deteriorate and the Ukraine is in more and more trouble, and Russia makes advances on the ground, and the Ukrainian regime collapses, and Europe is hugely embarrassed because their policy would have failed, and if they did something to counter that, increase their involvement, sold more. I don't know what they'll do. What I meant is that if the situation got worse, then will Europe turn to India and say that, you know, express unhappiness that we are continuing to have strong ties with Russia. Now we're going to chair the BRICS summit this year. And all the players, Russia will be there, Xi Jinping will be there. Uh, so uh, India is not going to take any action which will in any way disturb our ties with Russia and with all the other BRICS partners. And to what extent Europe will be happy or unhappy about this, uh, we will see. But all I can say, and I'll end with that, is that if on the European side there are people who can still think geopolitically and have a grip on strategy in general, they will understand what India is doing. But if you react emotionally and ideologically, then it's a different matter. But if you understand what India's position is, what its role is, the role it plays in BRICS, in preventing BRICS from becoming an anti-Western alliance, it's a different matter that within BRICS we see where we can mutually help each other. But if Russia and China try to make BRICS an anti-Western alliance or an anti-US alliance, India is not going to play that game. Therefore, we are in fact a bit of a safety valve uh, within BRICS, and we don't want the multipolar world either to be against the West. We want the multipolar world to give us an opportunity to have more say in international governance in a more cooperative framework with an accent on multilateralism. because there can't be multilateralism without multipolarity.
And perhaps with a seat on the UN Security Council.
That is very unlikely in the near future or the foreseeable future. But nevertheless, I think the fact that we've got a foot in the authoritarian door is helpful to the West. And if they had some good sense, they will see it that way.
Yeah.
All right, Mr. Sibal, thank you very much for bringing clarity to a deal that will shape not just trade flows, but India and Europe's strategic future far beyond this negotiating table. It was a pleasure having you. Mr. Sibal, thank you for speaking to Fair Observer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All the best.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.